In 1997, Anne Heche was everywhere. She was opposite Johnny Depp and Donnie Brasco. She was next to Tommy Lee Jones in Volcano. She was sharing the screen with Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman in Wag the Dog. She was, by any honest reading of the industry numbers, one of the hottest actresses in Hollywood. Studios wanted her, directors wanted her, and Harrison Ford, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, wanted to make a romantic comedy with her. A year later, almost none of that was true. She had attended one movie premiere with the wrong person on her arm, and Hollywood had quietly closed a door that had taken her a decade of extraordinary work to open. Not loudly, not in a press release. Just quietly, the way industries close doors on people they have decided are no longer convenient. The speed of the fall is the thing that deserves attention. In 1997, she was being described by industry observers as a lock for a long run at the top of Hollywood's A-list. She had demonstrated in a single 12-month period that she could carry a studio film, anchor an ensemble drama, inhabit a genre thriller, and hold her own next to Robert De Niro in a political satire. That is not a narrow skill set. That is the skill set of a major star. The studios understood this, which is why they wanted her. And then, in the specific way that Hollywood's decisions get made, not through official pronouncement, but through a collective withdrawal of interest, they decided they didn't. This is the story of Anne Heche. Not the tabloid version, not the breakdown version, not the reduced, flattened, punchline version that became the easiest way to talk about her after she was gone. The real version, the one that starts long before Hollywood and runs through everything it tried to bury. Because here is what gets left out every time someone tells this story. The woman Hollywood turned its back on had already survived things that would have ended most people before the cameras ever found her. And the woman Hollywood dismissed as a liability in 1997 spent the next 25 years refusing, with a stubborn, admirable, sometimes chaotic persistence, to act like she had been dismissed at all. If this is the kind of story you came here for, the real one, underneath the headlines, hit subscribe right now. There is more of this every single week, and you do not want to miss it. Chapter 1. Aurora, Ohio. Anne Celeste Heche was born on May 25, 1969, in Aurora, Ohio, the youngest of 5 children. Her father, Donald Heche, was a Baptist choir director. In the world outside their home, he was a man of faith, a pillar of the congregation, someone who led other people in worship. Inside the home, he was something else entirely, a closeted man carrying secrets that would cost every person around him, in different ways, for the rest of their lives. Aurora, Ohio, in 1969, was exactly the kind of American town that produces children who dream of somewhere else. Small, tidy, defined by church schedules and school routines and the particular social pressure of a community where everyone knows everyone, and the appearance of normality is both a comfort and a constraint. For a child whose home life was in radical, terrible contradiction with the presentation it made to the outside world, the pressure to maintain that appearance was not abstract. It was concrete and daily and specific. You dressed for church. You smiled at the congregation. You performed the life your family needed the town to believe in. And you learned, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, how to make a performance convincing enough that even the people closest to you could not see through it. The family moved constantly, 11 times before Anne was 12, through Ohio, New Jersey, and at one point briefly into an Amish community. The constant displacement meant she never built the kind of stable friendships that might have provided an outside perspective on what was happening inside the house. She learned instead to read rooms, to perform normalcy, to split what she felt from what she showed. Those were survival tools. They also turned out to be an actor's tools, and she would use them for the rest of her career. In her 2001 memoir, Call Me Crazy, and in subsequent interviews with Barbara Walters, Larry King, and ABC News, Heche made accusations about her father that were explicit, painful, and carried the particular quality of someone who had spent years in therapy learning the language for something she had lived without language for. She alleged that Donald Heche sexually abused her from infancy, that she contracted herpes from him as a young child, and that the abuse continued until she was around 12 years old. Her mother, Nancy Heche, denied knowing about the abuse. When Anne finally confronted her as an adult, after years of therapy had given her both the courage and the vocabulary to do it, her mother said, "Jesus loves you, Anne," and hung up the phone. Anne Heche later became a Christian author and speaker, whose public work included ministry aimed at helping people leave homosexuality. Anne's sister Abigail also disputed the claims, publicly stating that Anne had sometimes expressed doubts about her own memories. Anne was careful in interviews to acknowledge the limits of memory itself. "I didn't carry around a tape recorder," she told ABC News. "I didn't chisel anything in stone. Anybody can look and say, 'Well, how do you know for sure?' And that's one of the most painful things about it. You don't." The coping mechanism she had developed in childhood, almost certainly as a response to what was happening at home, was a dissociative fantasy world that she later described in detail in her memoir. She called it the fourth dimension. She imagined herself as a being called Celestia, a name derived from the Latin for heavenly, who had direct communication with God and was safe from the physical world in which all the pain was happening. Children under severe and sustained trauma frequently develop exactly this kind of internal refuge. Therapists who work in the area of childhood trauma recognize the mechanism. Anne eventually recognized it in herself through years of therapeutic work that she described with characteristic openness. The fourth dimension was not madness. It was survival, in the vocabulary available to a child who had no other tools. What is documented without dispute is the shape of what followed. In 1983, when Anne was 13, her father died of AIDS-related complications, a diagnosis she learned about only days before his death. The man who had presented himself to the world and to his own family as a devout heterosexual Christian had been dying of a disease that, in 1983, the public almost exclusively associated with the gay community. The revelation, the gap between the public man and the private one, was something Anne would spend years processing. The knowledge that the version of a person you have been taught to believe in can be entirely different from the person who actually exists. 3 months after her father's death, her 18-year-old brother Nathan was killed in a car accident. The family, already fractured, moved to Chicago. Anne took jobs after school, scooping ice cream at a Haagen-Dazs and waiting tables at a local dinner theater. The dinner theater job was, by her own account, where something clarified. She was a teenager waiting tables between acts, watching performers do the thing on stage that she had been doing in her head for years, inhabiting characters, speaking dialogue, existing in a version of reality that was more manageable than the actual one. She asked if she could audition. She did. And what people who saw her in those early performances described consistently was not a girl who showed potential. They described someone who already knew how to do it. The survival mechanism she had built in childhood, the ability to split her internal experience from what she presented outward, was not just a wound, it was a tool. And she had been practicing it, unconsciously, for her entire conscious life. She was scouted by talent agents while still in high school. She moved to New York the year she turned 18. She was going to be an actress. Nothing that had happened before this point was going to stop her. Chapter 2, Another World and the Real One. In 1987, 18 years old and newly arrived in New York, Anne Heche was cast in the NBC daytime soap opera Another World. She was given not one role but two. The twins Vicky Hudson and Marley Love, characters whose contrasting personalities allowed her to demonstrate, in the compressed dramatic economy of soap opera storytelling, a range that producers on bigger shows would eventually notice. The dual role was genuinely demanding work. Soap operas shoot enormous amounts of material on punishing schedules, often taping an episode a day, and to play two distinct characters simultaneously, to keep them visually and emotionally differentiated, to switch between them sometimes within a single scene, required the kind of technical precision that most young actors spend years developing. Anne developed it fast. In 1991, she won the Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Younger Actress in a Drama Series, the industry's recognition that something real was happening in a genre that the industry itself tended to dismiss. What the twin role gave her beyond the Emmy was something the soap opera format is uniquely positioned to provide: The experience of inhabiting someone else entirely, day after day, on a live or nearly live schedule that leaves no space for self-consciousness or second-guessing. Soap opera acting is, at its best, the most technically demanding form of performance on American television. You learn your lines overnight, you shoot them the next morning. You do not have the luxury of multiple takes or weeks of rehearsal. What you develop instead is the ability to be present, moment to moment, with whatever the scene requires. A skill that transfers directly to film work, and that critics who later watched Anne Heche perform opposite major stars consistently noted, without always knowing where it came from. She stayed on Another World until 1991, and by the time she left, she had built enough of a reputation to start auditioning for film roles. The early years of that climb were the slow, patient, unglamorous part of a career that would eventually look like an overnight success. Small parts in films, supporting roles that gave her screen time without giving her the credit, the kind of incremental progress that is invisible until it suddenly isn't. By the mid-1990s, the accumulation was starting to show. She appeared opposite Liev Schreiber and Catherine Keener in the indie film Walking and Talking in 1996. She had a role in The Juror that same year. And then, in 1997, everything accelerated at once. Donnie Brasco, in which she played the long-suffering wife of Johnny Depp's undercover FBI agent, earned her notices that put her firmly in the conversation for leading roles. Volcano followed. Then I Know What You Did Last Summer. Then Wag the Dog, alongside Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman, and a cast that represented the concentrated weight of American cinema prestige. The Donnie Brasco reviews in particular noted something that the films that followed would confirm. Anne Heche had an unusual ability to make her character the emotional truth of a scene, even when she was not the scene's ostensible subject. In Donnie Brasco, she plays Maggie, the wife of Johnny Depp's undercover FBI agent, the domestic anchor to a story that is nominally about the mafia and loyalty and deception. The scenes between them work because she makes Maggie's confusion and resilience feel entirely real, without ever making the film feel like it is about her at the expense of its actual premise. That is a very specific skill. Critics noticed it, directors noticed it, studios noticed it, and then stopped noticing her for reasons that had nothing to do with it. 4 films in 1997, each one with a major star, each one demonstrating a different dimension of what she could do. She could do intimate domestic drama, she could do genre horror, she could do political satire. She was, by every measurable industry signal, on the verge of the kind of career that most actors spend their entire professional lives working toward, and almost none of them reach. The industry had a word for what she was at this point, and the word was bankable. Bankable means that your name on a poster moves tickets. It means that investors are willing to put money behind a project because the star attached to it reduces their risk. It is the most commercially significant thing a performer can be called in Hollywood, because it is the thing that determines whether you get the call. And Anne Heche in the late months of 1997 was bankable in a way that most actors never become. That status, built over a decade of work from a soap opera in New York to the major studios of Los Angeles, was about to be used against her as a reason to withdraw it. She was 28 years old. She was being offered major multi-million-dollar picture deals. And she was about to make the one choice that Hollywood, in 1997, had absolutely no interest in her making. Chapter 3. The Vanity Fair Party. In March 1997, Anne Heche attended the Vanity Fair Oscar party. Across the room, she saw Ellen DeGeneres. DeGeneres was, at that precise moment, in the middle of something historic. She was preparing for the coming-out episode of her ABC sitcom Ellen, for both her fictional character and herself, that would air the following month and become one of the most watched television events of the decade. The two women talked, something connected. Within weeks, they were together. The speed of the relationship's public escalation is worth understanding in its cultural context. Ellen DeGeneres' coming-out episode had aired on April 30th, 1997, to an audience of 42 million people, and had been a lightning rod for both celebration and organized boycott. The American Family Association had lobbied ABC heavily. Advertisers had pulled out. The episode was sponsored by Chrysler and J.C. Penney after others withdrew. Into that charged and actively contested cultural moment, Anne Heche arrived as Ellen's girlfriend. Visible, committed, and completely unwilling to downplay what she was. She did not share the industry's calculation or its caution. She had spent her childhood performing a version of reality that bore no relationship to the one she was actually living, and she was not prepared to do it again. The relationship that followed was, by the accounts of everyone who observed it, genuine. They moved in together. They talked about having children. They discussed the possibility of marriage if Vermont's civil union law passed. And they were public about it in a way that, in 1997, was genuinely unprecedented for a Hollywood actress at the height of her commercial career. This was not Jodie Foster's approach. The carefully maintained privacy that allowed everyone to know without anyone having to say. Anne Heche brought Ellen DeGeneres to premieres. She put her name on the relationship. She refused to pretend. The first consequence came almost immediately. In April 1997, Anne had the premiere of Volcano. She was the co-lead of a major studio film. She wanted to bring her girlfriend. Fox executives, she later claimed, in multiple detailed public accounts, told her directly, if she brought Ellen to the premiere, she would be violating the studio's expectations, and her future with them would be terminated. She brought Ellen anyway. She was escorted out of the theater before the film finished. She was told she was not allowed to attend her own after-party, for fear that photographers would get pictures of her with a woman. Within days, the lucrative multi-picture contracts she had been negotiating were pulled from the table. I didn't do a studio picture for 10 years. She later told Page 6. I was fired from a $10 million picture deal and did not see the light of day in a studio picture. I felt like patient zero in cancel culture. The 6-day, 7-night situation is the most documented example of what Hollywood's response looked like in practice. Harrison Ford had requested Anne for his Touchstone Pictures romantic comedy. Studio executives, alarmed by the Volcano premiere incident and what it had revealed about Anne's willingness to be openly gay, tried to find a way out of the deal. In her posthumous memoir, Call Me Anne, published after her death, she describes how director Ivan Reitman sat her down in her trailer and asked, "Why can't you just be like Jodie Foster? Everybody knows it, she just doesn't talk about it." Harrison Ford, to his considerable credit, intervened. He called Anne directly and made his stance clear to the studio in a line that Anne repeated with evident affection for the rest of her life. "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn who you're sleeping with. We have a romantic comedy to make. Let's make it the best one that's ever happened." That is why, Anne always said, Harrison Ford was her hero. What Anne and Ellen represented to the wider culture in 1997 is worth pausing on, because it has been somewhat reduced in the retelling. They were not merely a celebrity couple whose private life became public. They were, at that specific moment, the most visible same-sex couple in American public life. Ellen's coming out episode, the one that aired on April 30th, 1997, and was watched by 42 million people, was a seismic cultural event. The fact that her girlfriend was a rising Hollywood actress who refused to hide, who appeared at industry events, who would not do the thing the industry asked her to do and keep the relationship out of the public eye, made the relationship twice as visible and twice as consequential. They were demonstrating, in real time and in public, that a gay relationship could be as normal and functional and present as any other kind of relationship. Hollywood did not want that demonstration. 6 Days, 7 Nights came out in 1998 and was a solid box office success, grossing over $160 million worldwide. The chemistry between Anne and Ford was exactly what Ford had promised it would be. Warm, funny, completely alive. Critics who saw past the tabloid noise noticed what was on screen. A romantic comedy leading lady who was genuinely good at the job. Audiences liked her. Ticket buyers responded to her. And none of it mattered, because the studio machinery that decided who got offered what and who got called back had already made its determination. If this is landing the way I think it is, if the gap between what Hollywood said about her and what was actually true is making you angry, share this video with someone who needs to see the full picture. Hit like, it costs nothing, and it genuinely helps. Chapter 4. The Freeze. The way this operated in practice, in Anne's telling, was less dramatic than the word blacklist implies, and more suffocating. It was not a door slamming. It was a phone that rang less. It was meetings that did not get followed up. It was the particular professional silence that descends when everyone in a room has made a decision and nobody says it aloud. She described, in multiple interviews over the years, the specific experience of feeling the industry's interest withdraw in real time. Of going from a woman whom every major studio was calling to a woman who had to fight for roles that 2 years earlier would have been offered without hesitation. The accumulation of those silences, spread across months and then years, was the actual shape of what happened to her. The blacklist, if that is the right word, and Anne Heche used the word publicly and repeatedly, with the specific evidence to back it up, did not operate as an official policy. There was no memo. There was no industry-wide agreement. What there was instead was a collective withdrawal of interest from an actress who had committed the specific sin of being visibly, unapologetically in love with a woman at a time when Hollywood's unspoken contract with its leading ladies required heterosexual legibility as a condition of employment. This is not a theory or an interpretation. It is what the major studios did. And they did it openly enough that Anne Heche was able to describe the specific conversations that preceded specific decisions. The Fox executive who told her to leave Ellen at home, the Ivan Reitman conversation in the trailer, the pattern that emerged in the year after the Volcano premiere, in which the phone from the big studios simply stopped ringing. It is worth being specific about the Gracie's Choice performance, because it illustrates the scale of what the blacklist was costing both Anne and the audiences who might have watched her. She plays Rowena Lawson, a drug-addicted, neglectful mother whose daughter is forced to fight in court to keep her siblings together, a role that requires her to inhabit an unsparing portrait of parental collapse, to embody both tragic vulnerability and the devastating chaos of addiction, and to make the audience believe in a woman whose life is coming apart at every seam. The Emmy nomination she received for it came from the Television Academy's assessment of the performance itself, stripped of any context about the actress's personal life. The work spoke. The problem was that the studios had stopped listening. She was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award in 2004 for her performance in the Lifetime television movie Gracie's Choice. She received a Tony Award nomination for Best Actress in a Play for her work opposite Alec Baldwin in Broadway's 20th Century. These are real achievements from real institutions that evaluate work on its merits, and they tell you that the work had not declined. What had declined was Hollywood's willingness to put its marketing budget behind a woman it had decided was a liability. The Gus Van Sant Psycho remake in 1998, a shot-for-shot color recreation of the Hitchcock original, which had Heche in the Janet Leigh role of Marion Crane, is often cited as a misfire that damaged her standing. It is worth being precise about this. The film itself received mixed to negative reviews. Heche's performance in it, playing the same character in the same scenes with effectively the same script, was described by critics as technically accomplished. The failure of Psycho was a failure of concept. It was not a failure of the actress who played the lead. Return to Paradise, also from 1998, told the story of an American facing execution for drug charges in Malaysia, and required Heche to carry a legal and moral thriller on her back as Beth Eastern, the fiercely dedicated defense attorney fighting to save his life. It was a genuinely difficult role. She delivered it. The film received strong reviews and was later praised as one of the underseen films of the decade. It did not make her a studio darling again, because studio calculations did not run on the merit of individual performances. They ran on something else entirely. The Birth film from 2004, Jonathan Glazer's strange, quiet drama in which Nicole Kidman plays a widow who becomes convinced that a young boy is the reincarnation of her dead husband, has a supporting performance from Anne Heche that reviewers at the time described as one of the finest things in an already distinguished ensemble. She plays a woman whose own grief intersects with Kidman's character's breakdown, and she brings to the role the precise emotional calibration of someone who understands grief from the inside. Spread from 2009 opposite Ashton Kutcher is a lesser film but contains the same quality, a commitment to being genuinely present in scenes that lesser actors would coast through. She did not coast, she never did. There is a question that the blacklist period raises, and that tends not to get asked directly. What were audiences losing? Because the answer to that question, if you look at the work rather than the gossip, is considerable. Anne Heche was one of the best romantic comedy leading ladies of her generation. The combination of qualities the genre requires, genuine wit, physical comedy instincts, the ability to make an audience root for you across 2 hours of manufactured obstacles, was something she had in abundance. She could do it with Harrison Ford. She could have done it with any number of co-stars in any number of films if the studios had been willing to cast her. They were not. And the genre suffered for it, even if the genre never knew why. Chapter 5, Kentua Creek. On August 18, 2000, Anne Heche and Ellen DeGeneres issued a joint statement announcing that they were no longer in a relationship. The language was careful and mutual, and said very little about what had actually happened between two people who had been together for 3.5 years through one of the most publicly costly relationships in modern Hollywood history. The next day, Anne got in her car and drove north from Los Angeles into the Central Valley of California until the vehicle broke down near Fresno. She got out of the car in a bra and shorts. She walked more than a mile through the rural heat to the door of a stranger's ranch house in Kentua Creek. The woman who answered the door, Araceli Campis, recognized her immediately from 6 Days, 7 Nights. Heche came inside, behaved in ways that alarmed Campis, made statements about spaceships and heaven and being Celestia. Campis called the authorities. Deputies took Heche to the University Medical Center in Fresno. She was admitted to the psychiatric unit and released after several hours. The story became, within hours, a national punchline. The actress, the desert, the spaceship. The punchline was easier than the question underneath it, which was, what happens to a person who has survived childhood sexual abuse, whose father abused her and then died of a disease he had hidden, whose mother hung up when confronted with the truth, who had then spent 3.5 years in a relationship that cost her a major studio career, who had been building the courage and the therapy and the time to write a book about all of it? What happens to that person when the relationship that had given her the courage and the cost finally ends, all in the same day? The punchline is still the thing most people remember. Anne herself later said she was coming apart. She later said that the Fresno incident was, in her understanding of her own psychology, the culmination of unresolved trauma surfacing after 3 decades of suppression, that the altered state she entered was the end of something that had been building since childhood, not a random malfunction. She also acknowledged being under the influence of ecstasy. Both things were true simultaneously. The media found the ecstasy and the spaceship more useful than the trauma, which is not a surprise, and is also not a reason to leave it that way. The title of the memoir was, itself, a provocation. Call Me Crazy was Anne claiming, in advance, the word that would be used against her, absorbing it, turning it around, wearing it as a form of defiance. The book was structured as an unconventional memoir, partly in verse, partly in fragmented prose, mixing poetry with conventional narrative in a way that reviewers found disorienting and that read in hindsight as a formal enactment of the way trauma actually works. Not linearly, not neatly, not in the shapes that conventional storytelling provides. The media coverage of the book's publication focused heavily on the Fresno incident and on the revelations about the abuse, which was perhaps inevitable. What got less coverage was the quality of the writing itself, the honesty of it, the refusal to make herself sympathetic in the way memoir conventionally demands, the willingness to describe herself from the inside without self-protection. She published Call Me Crazy in September 2001. The memoir was raw in the way that only genuine accounting can be raw. Not polished, not flattering, not shaped into the narrative Hollywood would have preferred. She described the abuse. She described the Fresno incident and what she believed it meant. She described the relationship with Ellen and what it had cost her. She described the industry that had decided her love life was a liability. When family members disputed her claims in public interviews, Anne held her ground. The book became a bestseller, and Anne went on tour to promote it, sat down with the most famous interviewers in America, and said everything in the book out loud, on television, to anyone who was willing to listen. Chapter 6. The Comeback That Never Stopped Happening. What followed the Fresno incident and the Call Me Crazy publication was not, as several industry observers predicted, the end of Anne Heche's career. It was the beginning of the most interesting phase of it. The phase in which she operated almost entirely outside the commercial infrastructure that had decided she was inconvenient, and did some of the most critically respected work of her life. She married Coleman Coley LaFoon in 2001. They had a son, Homer, born in 2002. The marriage ended in divorce in 2009. She then had a relationship with actor James Tupper, whom she met on the set of the ABC series Men in Trees in 2006. They had a son together, Atlas, born in 2009. The relationship with Tupper ended in 2018. Men in Trees ran for 2 seasons and gave her something the studio system had tried to take away: the chance to be a leading lady on American television week after week, in a format that audiences could follow and return to. She was good in it. She was, in fact, exactly as good as she had been in the late 1990s, which should have surprised no one, but somehow felt like a surprise anyway, because the narrative that had attached itself to her name in the intervening years had made it easy to forget. The Men in Trees period from 2006 to 2008 was, in the assessment of people who watched the show carefully, the closest thing to a public rehabilitation that the industry offered her. And it was telling that it came from television rather than film. Television in the mid-2000s was moving faster than cinema in its willingness to cast actors whose complicated personal histories the film industry had used as reasons not to hire them. The ABC drama series gave Anne a character she could build week by week. Marin Frist, a relationship expert who retreats to rural Alaska after her fiancé's infidelity, and she built it with the accumulated craft of someone who had been performing since she was a teenager in Ohio. The show was not a massive hit. It was a working actress working well, which is the most honest form of a comeback. Cedar Rapids in 2011, directed by Miguel Arteta, was the kind of film that demonstrates what the industry had been wasting. A sharp, warm ensemble comedy in which Heche played a supporting role with the relaxed confidence of someone who has been doing this for 20 years and has nothing left to prove. Critics responded. The film found its audience, and the notes that ran in the reviews, charismatic, funny, effortlessly watchable, were the same notes that had been written about her in 1997, before anyone had decided her private life was relevant to the question of whether she could act. Catfight in 2016 was a dark comedy in which she and Sandra Oh played rivals whose feud escalates into brutal physical violence, and it was startling and funny and far more committed than the premise should have required. She had a recurring role on Chicago PD. She appeared on All Rise. She did Dancing with the Stars in 2020 and spoke, in a pre-recorded segment that aired nationally, about the relationship with Ellen and the career that it cost her. Measured, clear-eyed, without bitterness. Those repercussions that happened, she said, are to me what created a part of the change. The change she was referring to was real. The world in which she and Ellen had been the most famous same-sex couple in Hollywood, and in which that visibility had cost Anne a major studio career, had been replaced by a world where gay characters played by straight actors could win Academy Awards, where major studios had LGBTQ advocacy offices and Pride Month marketing campaigns, where the thing Anne had been penalized for doing in 1997 was now, 20 years later, something the industry celebrated as progressive. She had helped create that change, in the most expensive way possible, and the industry that benefited from it had never particularly acknowledged the bill. Chapter 7. Mar Vista, August 2022. On August 5, 2022, Anne Heche drove a blue Mini Cooper into a residential garage in the Mar Vista neighborhood of Los Angeles. She backed out and drove away. She then drove the car at speed into a single-story home on a residential street. The vehicle erupted in heavy fire. 59 firefighters took 65 minutes to access the vehicle and extract her. She was rushed to the hospital and subsequently transferred to the Grossman Burn Center at West Hills Hospital with severe burns and placed on a ventilator. The woman who lived in the home Anne crashed into, Lynn Michelle, lost her belongings and her pets in the fire that followed the accident. Her loss was real and significant, and it is part of the story of that day. A fundraiser organized for Michelle in the aftermath raised more than $200,000. Later, Michelle stated publicly that she felt compassion for Anne, that she had not wanted Anne to die, and that she offered her condolences to the family. That act of grace, offered publicly by the person who had suffered the most direct harm from the crash, was less widely reported than the crash itself. It tends not to get included in the version of the story that focuses on Anne as a cautionary tale. The response on social media in the hours after the crash was, by the accounts of many who witnessed it, disturbing in a specific way. A significant number of the posts were hostile. References to the Fresno incident. References to the relationship with Ellen. Jokes. The woman who had crashed her car and was in critical condition in a burn unit was, for a meaningful portion of the public conversation, primarily an opportunity to revisit the most embarrassing moments of her biography. The crash reignited conversations that had been dormant for years. Who was Anne Heche? Why had her career gone the way it went? What had happened in Fresno? Younger viewers who had grown up in a different cultural moment, one in which the relationship with Ellen DeGeneres would read not as scandal but as history, encountered the story of what had been done to her career in 1997 and found it genuinely shocking. They had grown up in a world that claimed to have moved past all of that, and here was the evidence of what the moving past had actually cost someone who had been there at the beginning of the change. The posthumous reassessment was real, and it was too late, and both of those things were true simultaneously. She was declared brain dead on August 11, 2022, the date recorded as her legal death under California law. Her heart was kept beating on life support for several days so that doctors could match her organs with viable recipients according to her wishes before she was peacefully taken off life support on August 14th. The hospital staff conducted an honor walk as she was taken to the organ donation procedure, a mark of respect from the medical staff for a patient who was giving life to others. Her son Homer, 20 years old and the child of her first marriage, released a statement that has stayed with people who read it. After 6 days of almost unbelievable emotional swings, I am left with a deep, wordless sadness. He thanked the thousands of people who had sent their hearts to him. He said that he hoped his mother was free from pain. She had been working on a follow-up memoir, Call Me Anne, at the time of the crash. Her editor, Renee Sears, described her as enthusiastic, open to rewrites, with no ego about the work. Sears said Anne had been revising right up to the end, still reaching toward the version of the story she wanted to tell. The book was published posthumously in January 2023, as close to what Anne had written as possible, with the final pass completed without her. What she actually was. She was also, and this matters for how we understand the shape of what was done to her, one of the few actresses of her generation who spoke openly about childhood sexual abuse at a time when doing so was still professionally radioactive. She did not speak in euphemism. She was specific, and she was specific in public, on national television, with the names and the details and the acknowledgement that she could not offer courtroom admissible proof, but was telling the truth as she lived it. That kind of public truth-telling was not rewarded by Hollywood in 2001. It was, in the cultural ecosystem of that moment, one more reason to see her as a liability rather than an asset. The industry's comfort with a performer is in part a function of how much disruption they bring to the room. Anne Heche brought a great deal of disruption and meant to. Anne Heche was a Daytime Emmy winner. She was a Tony Award nominee. She was a Primetime Emmy Award nominee. She delivered nearly 100 performances across television, film, and stage across a career that spanned 30 years. She was the leading lady in romantic comedies during the era when romantic comedies were the dominant commercial genre in American cinema, and she was good at it. Genuinely, measurably, technically good at it, in a way that the industry refused to allow her to demonstrate fully. She was also a woman who survived things that would have destroyed a less determined person, who wrote about those things with honesty and courage, at a time when honesty about childhood abuse and mental health crises was still professionally risky, who stood next to the woman she loved at a movie premiere when every economic incentive she had screamed at her to leave that woman at home, and who spent the next 25 years demonstrating that the industry's verdict on her was wrong. It is also worth noting, for a channel that pays attention to these things, that Anne Heche was visually distinctive in a way that the era's fashion history records. The late 1990s press photographs of her and Ellen at the Emmy Awards, the Vanity Fair parties, the industry events she refused to attend alone, document two women who dressed with intention and confidence at a time when what they were doing together was still considered controversial. Anne in particular favored a clean, precise aesthetic, structured jackets, confident color, that read, on camera and off it, as someone who had thought about how she wanted to appear in the world and had dressed accordingly. The image she projected was one of a woman who knew exactly who she was, which was, in the context of what Hollywood was trying to tell her about herself, its own form of resistance. There is a version of this story in which Anne Heche is a cautionary tale. The actress who made a choice that cost her everything, who fell apart in the desert, who never quite got back to where she was. That version exists and is easy to find. It has been told many times. There is another version in which she's something more interesting than a cautionary tale, in which the woman who was dropped from major studio deals for bringing her girlfriend to a premiere went on to receive Tony and Emmy nominations and to build a career that lasted 3 more decades, in which the woman who broke down in a Fresno desert wrote a memoir about it, and sold it and toured it, and talked about it on national television, and then made more films and more television and more theater, in which the woman Hollywood turned its back on kept working, kept creating, kept refusing to disappear. Her son Atlas, who was 13 years old when she died, was born in the middle of the period when Anne was doing the most interesting work of her post-Blacklist career. The independent films, the television series, the Broadway run. He grew up knowing a mother who worked constantly and who talked about her life with unusual directness and who had an opinion about everything, including Hollywood, that she was not shy about expressing. The person her children knew was not the tabloid version. She was the mother who helped with homework and showed up and called first, as she joked in one interview, before coming home. She was, by the accounts of the people who knew her best, a genuinely funny, genuinely present person, who had found a way to live with the weight of everything that had happened to her, without pretending it was lighter than it was. She told the New York Times in 2009, "I think I was a wonderful spokeswoman for the right to love." She was not wrong about that. And the industry that penalized her for it, that decided in 1997 that love was less important than marketability, was demonstrably, measurably wrong about her. Her sons, Homer and Atlas, lost their mother at 53. The list of things she did not get to do is real and long. The films she did not make. The roles she was not offered. The decade she spent doing work that was consistently excellent and consistently undervalued by the machinery that had made its decision about her before the decade started. Those losses are worth naming. And so is this. She made the losses count. She named them publicly, in her own words, for the record. She told the story that Hollywood hoped she would not tell. She did it once in 2001, and she was still doing it in 2020. And she was still writing it down in 2022 when the accident happened. The woman who came from Aurora, Ohio, with a childhood full of things no child should have to survive, who walked through a desert in her underwear and became a punchline, and then wrote a book about what had driven her there, and then got back up and kept working. That woman deserved a full career in the industry she had given everything to serve. She did not get it. She got something harder and stranger and, in its own way, more durable. A story that does not fit into a single version, that resists the punchline, that keeps returning the question back to the people who decided she was the problem. The record she made, the 2 memoirs, the interviews, the on-camera statements that kept coming through Dancing with the Stars and magazine profiles and podcast conversations in the years before the crash, is a sustained, documented account of what it cost to be openly gay in Hollywood in 1997. It is not a theory. It is named executives, specific conversations, documented contract cancellations. It is the kind of evidence that historians of the entertainment industry, looking back at this period from a distance, will not be able to ignore. She made sure of that. She was, in the end, a very good record keeper of the things that were done to her, which is its own form of survival and its own form of justice. Anne Heche did not turn her back on Hollywood. Hollywood turned its back on her, and she spent 25 years making sure there was a record of which way it happened. If this story made you see Anne Heche the way she actually was, not the tabloid version, the real version, share it. Share it with someone who only knows the punchlines and deserves to know the rest. Like this video, leave a comment. It matters more than you think. Subscribe if you want to stay in this world. The real stories, the careers that should have been, the women Hollywood tried to erase and couldn't. There is more of this every single week, and every one of them deserves to be told. See you in the next one.